Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. Tonight, we enter the world of Miss Marple in the riddle of the 11 o'clock telegram. A cryptic message, a silent village, and a question that cannot wait till morning. Who sent the telegram, and why at that hour? Pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. Good evening, dear listener. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? A quiet room with the lamps turned low, or perhaps on a walk beneath the evening sky. Wherever you are, keep your wits about you, for this tale begins with something as harmless as paper and ink, and ends in murder. At precisely 11 o'clock that morning, the telegram arrived at the post office in the village of St. Mary Mead. The clatter of the telegraph machine startled young Tommy Briggs, the new assistant who still fumbled with the messages. By the time he carried it to the counter, Miss Emily Carter, the postmistress, had already peered over his shoulder with the curiosity that came naturally to her profession. "It's for Mrs. Lydia Arkwright," Emily announced, raising an eyebrow. "Special delivery, marked urgent. Odd, isn't it? Who would be writing to her at such an hour?" Tommy, too green to know when to stay silent, muttered, "It says to meet at the vicarage gate at 11 sharp." Emily hushed him quickly, but the words had already been heard by Mrs. Price Ridley, who was collecting her morning paper. Within minutes, the telegram's contents had traveled farther than its sender ever intended. By 11:15, Mrs. Arkwright herself, a fashionable widow of 40, was seen striding toward the vicarage in her dove-grey coat. She did not return. The gossip spread with the speed of a summer storm. Whispers ran from the high street to the tea tables. Lydia Arkwright had received a mysterious telegram, gone to meet someone, and vanished. Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window with her knitting, heard the news from her maid. She lifted her head, her blue eyes narrowing. "A telegram at 11, she mused softly. "That's not the sort of time for social calls. It sounds more like an appointment one doesn't wish to keep in daylight." By evening, the vicar himself had sent word round that Mrs. Arkwright had not been seen at his gate, nor anywhere else. Her cottage lay silent, her bed unslept in. And then, as the church clock rang midnight, a scream shattered the stillness of the village. Mr. Hargreaves, the church warden, had stumbled over a figure at the edge of the churchyard, Lydia Arkwright, lifeless, a telegram clutched in her gloved hand. "Stay with us until the end. Only then will the truth be revealed." The morning after the dreadful discovery, St. Mary Mead was already humming like a disturbed beehive. The tiny post office, which had always served as both a place of business and the village's unofficial exchange of news, found itself at the very heart of speculation. Miss Emily Carter, the postmistress, stood behind her counter with a solemn face, though her eyes betrayed the faint sparkle of someone at once troubled and fascinated. For Emily, who had always prided herself on discretion, it was a strain to have so much knowledge and yet to pretend to have none at all. By 9:30, the queue of villagers stretched to the door. Some had legitimate business, of course, letters to send, parcels to collect, but most had come to glean what crumbs of information they could from Miss Carter and her assistant. Mrs. Price Ridley was among the first. She swept in with the air of someone who knew far more than she intended to say. "Such a terrible shock," she murmured loudly, setting her empty basket upon the counter. Poor Lydia, struck down in her prime. Though, mind you, I always said there was something rather too modern about her. A dove-grey coat indeed. Not quite the thing for the country. Miss Carter's lips tightened. "It isn't proper to speak so, Mrs. Price Ridley. A life has been lost." Yes, the older woman agreed hastily, though she looked rather pleased to be at the center of attention. "But I hear she was summoned by a telegram. One doesn't get such messages without cause, you know." Tommy Briggs, busy with the parcel scales, flushed scarlet. He avoided Emily's eye, but the damage was already done. Half the queue leaned forward in eager anticipation. Miss Carter snapped the drawer shut a little too loudly. "The contents of telegrams are private," she said firmly, and should not be repeated by those with loose tongues. But Mrs. Price Ridley only sniffed, her expression one of practiced innocence. Oh, quite so. Quite so. But still someone must have wanted her at that gate, and it can't have been for anything good. Behind her, Mrs. Hartnell, always a willing partner in gossip, added in a conspiratorial whisper, "They say she was found clutching it in her hand." Imagine. A dying message, perhaps? Gasps rippled through the little crowd. Tommy dropped a parcel in his fluster, and Emily's cheeks blazed. It was at this moment that Miss Marple herself stepped through the door. She wore her usual soft grey shawl and carried her knitting bag as if she had come merely to collect a packet of wool. Her mild eyes moved from one villager to the next, pausing ever so slightly on Tommy's guilty face. "Such excitement, I see," she remarked gently. "One might think it was a wedding instead of a tragedy." A hush fell, as it often did when Miss Marple spoke. Her tone was soft, almost apologetic, but those who knew her felt the quiet weight of her words. Mrs. Price Ridley was flustered. "We were only remarking on poor Mrs. Arkwright, Miss Marple. A dreadful business." "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit where she stood. So sudden, too. One moment, a telegram. The next, she let the sentence trail away. Strange, isn't it, how such things arrive at the very hour when people are least prepared. 11 o'clock is neither here nor there, too late for breakfast, too early for luncheon. The observation, simple as it was, drew frowns of consideration from the gathered crowd. Miss Marple smiled as if she had spoken only of the weather. Mr. Denham, the grocer, stepped forward. "If you ask me, it's some London affair. Lydia had friends in the city, people who came down in motor cars. Not quite the sort we're used to here. I dare say this was no village quarrel." But Mrs. Hartnell shook her head vigorously. London or no London, the fact remains she was found in the churchyard, and what respectable person arranges a meeting in such a place? Mark my words, it was someone local. "Someone local," Mrs. Price Ridley echoed, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting, her expression one of mild interest. "People do strange things when they wish not to be observed," she said softly. "A churchyard may seem unlikely, but it is also quiet, particularly at that hour." The crowd shifted uneasily. In the silence that followed, the post office bell jangled once more, and in came Inspector Graves, his boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. "Now then," he said, sweeping the room with a sharp glance. "I know what's being whispered. Best you all remember that speculation only makes trouble. The matter's under investigation." Emily Carter visibly relaxed, though Mrs. Price Ridley looked disappointed. But Inspector Graves did not stop there. He fixed Tommy with a stern eye. "And you, young man, keep your tongue behind your teeth. Repeating private communications could land you in serious trouble." Tommy stammered out an apology, his ears crimson. Miss Marple's needles paused, then resumed, the faintest smile flickering across her lips as though some small piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. After the inspector's departure, the crowd thinned, though not before several villagers lingered at the door to exchange hushed theories. When the room was nearly empty, Miss Marple approached the counter. "Just a packet of darning wool, if you please, Emily. Grey, to match the socks of a certain godson of mine." As Emily fetched it, Miss Marple leaned a fraction closer. Her voice was low, intended for the postmistress alone. Poor Tommy. He looked frightened, did he not? Almost as though he feared what else might be discovered. Emily started, glancing at the boy, who busied himself with the ledger. "He's only nervous." Such a terrible shock for the village. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, slipping her coins across the counter, "and shocks, I find, often make people say things they oughtn't." She tucked the wool into her bag and stepped out into the bright morning sun. As she walked down the lane, her mind turned not on Lydia Arkwright's fashionable coat or her friends from London, but on the curious phrasing of that telegram. Meet at the vicarage gate, 11 sharp. It was an odd instruction. If the sender had truly wished to meet her, why not knock upon her cottage door? Why not call at a respectable hour? The wording suggested secrecy, urgency, and perhaps even a trap. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. In her long years in St. Mary Mead, she had seen human nature play out in every form, from petty rivalries to quiet acts of kindness. She knew that people often dressed their intentions in respectable clothing, but the truth peeked out at the hems. And now, she thought, someone in the village was already lying. From the far end of the lane came the sound of hurried footsteps. Miss Marple turned just in time to see Mrs. Hartnell, her face pale, rushing from her cottage with a folded slip of paper in her hand. She glanced nervously before slipping it into her handbag. When she caught sight of Miss Marple watching, she started, muttered a quick greeting, and nearly stumbled in her haste to be away. Miss Marple stood still, the sun casting a neat shadow at her feet. Her knitting needles clicked softly in her bag. Another telegram, perhaps, or merely another lie in a village already full of whispers. The answer, she knew, would not remain hidden for long. The sun had barely risen above the hedgerows when Inspector Graves made his presence known in the village once again. A tall, square-shouldered man with a purposeful stride, he carried himself with the air of one who liked matters neat and orderly. Murders, of course, were never neat, but Graves had his methods direct, practical, and inclined toward the obvious. By 8:30, he had already called at Mrs. Arkwright's cottage. Word spread quickly that the police had found her purse on the table, untouched, her bed unrumpled, and a half-drunk cup of tea still standing cold in the parlor. That detail, whispered from house to house, struck many as peculiar. For what respectable widow would leave her home with a telegram in hand without so much as finishing her tea? Miss Marple heard these reports from her nephew's housemaid, who recounted them with a flourish of dramatic pauses. She only nodded, her needles flashing quietly. Half-drunk tea, she murmured to herself. A person rarely leaves such a thing unless the summons was pressing or unwelcome. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves had already begun narrowing his suspicions. By the afternoon, it was the talk of the High Street that he had questioned Mr. Leonard Weatherby, a local solicitor known for his immaculate moustache and slightly pompous air. Weatherby had long been rumored to have taken an interest in Lydia Arkwright's affairs, both financial and otherwise. In the snug of the Blue Boar Inn, where Graves paused for a midday pint, villagers buzzed with speculation. "Weatherby was seen walking past the churchyard not 2 nights ago," declared Mr. Denham, the grocer, his voice carrying more than he intended. "And wasn't it Weatherby," added Mrs. Price Ridley with relish, "who advised Lydia when she sold that small parcel of land last spring? Some said she let it go for less than it was worth." Miss Marple, who had chosen that very moment to step in for her modest glass of port, took a seat in the corner and listened with her usual quiet patience. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they thought no one important was listening. It wasn't long before Inspector Graves himself entered, his brow furrowed, his notebook already worn with hastily scribbled lines. He addressed the room with a firm tone. "Mr. Weatherby claims he spent yesterday morning in his office, drafting papers. Yet I find it interesting that no one can confirm his whereabouts between 10 and 11. I'll be speaking with him further." A ripple of satisfaction ran through the crowd. The village loved nothing more than a suspect, and Leonard Weatherby, with his stiff collars and sharper tongue, made an excellent one. From her corner, Miss Marple set down her port. "Oh, but surely Mr. Weatherby is always punctual, Inspector," she said softly, her voice mild as milk. The room turned toward her. Graves gave a short laugh. "Punctual, Miss Marple?" She nodded, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as naturally as breathing. "I have observed it. Mr. Weatherby arrives at church exactly 3 minutes before the bell every Sunday. He calls at Mrs. Hartnell's precisely on the first Tuesday of the month to collect his papers. Such regularity is not easily broken. It is ingrained. People change their habits when murder's involved, Graves said gruffly. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, her eyes twinkling. Or perhaps they cling to them all the tighter. The inspector made a non-committal noise, and the villagers shifted uncomfortably. But her words had sown a seed of doubt. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple passed Weatherby's office on the high street. The blinds were drawn, but she noticed a curious thing, a smear of damp earth on the cobblestones just outside the door, as though someone with muddy boots had entered in haste. She bent, examined the mark, and tucked the observation away in her mind. Inside, Weatherby was being pressed by Graves himself. The solicitor's voice carried through the thin walls. "I tell you, Inspector, I was at my desk all morning, drafting wills, reviewing deeds. My housekeeper can confirm it." A pause, then Graves' voice, sharp. "Your housekeeper says you left the office at 10:30 and did not return until near noon. Care to explain that?" There was silence. Heavy, damning silence. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting bag. It was not the silence of a guilty man, she thought, but rather the silence of someone calculating what to say. At last, Weatherby replied. His tone clipped. "I went walking. A man must stretch his legs. If you must know, I walked as far as the mill road and back." But Miss Marple knew, as did any villager with sense, that the mill road was muddy that morning from the night's rain. That explained the smear of earth. What it did not explain was why Mr. Weatherby had concealed such a harmless errand, unless, of course, it was not so harmless. That evening, as twilight fell and lamps glowed in cottage windows, Miss Marple was invited to tea at the vicarage. Reverend Clement and his wife, kind souls both, were eager for her company. Over buttered scones, the vicar's wife leaned close. "Do you think it possible, Miss Marple, that Mr. Weatherby could have done such a dreadful thing?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I think it is possible that he may have told a small lie. And small lies," she added gently, "are often the most revealing of all." The vicar frowned. "And the telegram? Who could have sent it?" "That," Miss Marple said, setting her cup down, "is the very riddle. A telegram is a curious instrument. One cannot disguise one's hand, yet one may disguise one's intent. Who, I wonder, stood to gain from drawing Lydia Arkwright to that gate?" Even as she spoke, a knock sounded at the vicarage door. The maid returned a moment later, her face pale. "It's Inspector Graves, sir. He says there's been a development." The inspector strode in, his expression grim. He held a folded slip of paper in his hand. "We've traced the telegram," he said without preamble. "It was sent from the post office in Much Haddam yesterday morning at 10, and the clerk there remembers clearly that Mr. Leonard Weatherby himself was the sender." A gasp escaped the vicar's wife. The Reverend Clement muttered a prayer under his breath. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, before she laid them aside. "Curious," she said softly. "Most curious indeed. For a man so punctual, why would Mr. Weatherby send a message to summon Mrs. Arkwright at 11 sharp if he meant her harm? It seems too precise." Her eyes lifted, serene but piercing. She knew that the inspector did not yet grasp precision in human affairs, and was rarely innocent. It was either the mark of honesty or the mask of deceit, and one of those two, she thought, would lead her straight to the truth. But outside, beyond the vicarage garden, a shadow moved quickly along the hedge. Someone else had been listening, waiting, and that someone now quickened their step toward the village square, eager to spread or conceal what they had overheard. Miss Marple, standing at the window, caught the faint movement. She did not stir, but her eyes grew sharp. In St. Mary Mead, lies did not last long in the daylight, and already the village was hiding more than one. Morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with deceptive calm. The larks rose above the fields, milk carts clattered along the lanes, and housemaids swept the front steps with a briskness that suggested normal life continued. Yet beneath the surface, the village throbbed with restless speculation. Murder had a way of rearranging the daily rhythm, and nothing in the parish seemed quite ordinary. Inspector Graves, never one to linger over sentiment, had already fixed Leonard Weatherby in his sights. The solicitor's name passed from lip to lip with a kind of satisfied relish, as though the village had been waiting for years to find him in some scandal. But Miss Marple, sitting serenely at her parlor window with her knitting in hand, was less easily persuaded. "Too neat," she said softly, watching the postman bicycle past. When suspicion comes too quickly, it is often directed. And direction, like the signpost at the crossroads, is rarely accidental. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Graves himself, his boots leaving damp marks upon her mat. He removed his hat awkwardly, as if aware that in Miss Marple's sitting room his authority carried less weight than usual. "I thought it best to inform you, Miss Marple," he began. "We've searched Mrs. Arkwright's cottage more thoroughly. Routine work. Found nothing of significance." Miss Marple gestured to the chair by the hearth. "Do sit, Inspector. I always think a second look finds more than the first. You say nothing was found, but that is a kind of finding in itself." Graves gave a small grunt, but lowered himself into the chair. He opened his notebook. One thing of curiosity. A button. Brass with a faint crest upon it. Found beneath the carpet near the parlor hearthrug. Doesn't match any of her garments. Likely nothing, but we'll have it examined. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though she kept her tone mild. "A button can tell much, Inspector. Clothes speak of their wearers, and a stray button speaks of an encounter. I wonder if the hearthrug has recently moved." "Hard to say." The maid didn't notice, but Arkwright had no brass buttons in her wardrobe. That much is clear. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Then perhaps someone visited who wished not to be noticed. Visitors often betray themselves, not in what they bring, but in what they leave behind. Graves snapped the notebook shut, faintly irritated. "It's one button, Miss Marple. We have a man who sent the telegram and a body found at the place and time he named. That's enough for me." "Enough for an arrest, perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, "but not for the truth. The truth is rarely so obliging." The inspector rose, muttering about paperwork, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the image of that button. Brass, she thought, with a crest. Not the sort of thing one bought cheaply at the haberdasher. Such details spoke of position, uniform, or society. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the high street under the pretext of calling at the draper's. She paused, as if by chance, before the window of Mr. Weatherby's office. Inside, he sat stiffly at his desk, the blinds drawn halfway. His jacket, laid across the back of a chair, bore plain dark buttons. No brass, no crest. But as she turned away, she caught sight of Mr. Harold Sims, Lydia Arkwright's gardener, emerging from the inn. His shabby coat, buttoned to the chin, bore one empty, threadbare hole near the waist. He noticed her gaze and tugged the garment tighter, nodding curtly before hurrying down the lane. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting bag. She thought of the brass button, the missing fastener on the gardener's coat, and the nervous haste in his step. A gardener, she reminded herself, knew much of comings and goings and often saw what others missed. At the draper's shop, conversation hummed as usual. Mrs. Price Ridley, as tireless as ever, stood at the counter examining ribbons while delivering her opinions in a steady stream. Of course, it was bound to end badly, she was saying. A widow like Mrs. Arkwright, entertaining gentlemen callers at all hours. Weatherby, yes, but others too. I saw Mr. Sims at her gate more than once, and that's hardly fitting for a man in service. Mrs. Hartnell, plump and flushed, leaned closer. They say she promised him extra wages if he worked beyond his hours. But I wonder what else was promised. These arrangements can become complicated. Miss Marple, pretending to study skeins of wool, allowed her eyes to twinkle as though amused by the village chatter. Inwardly, she noted the tone of envy sharpened by suspicion. Such sentiments often revealed more about the speaker than the subject. By evening, the Blue Boar Inn was thick with speculation. Mr. Denham insisted it must have been Weatherby. The telegram proves it plain as day. Others countered that Sims was the likelier culprit, for his temper was well known when drink loosened his tongue. It was there that Inspector Graves appeared again, weary but determined. He ordered a pint, stood by the hearth, and declared to the assembled crowd, "We'll be questioning Mr. Sims tomorrow. There's a strong possibility he knew more of Mrs. Arkwright than he's admitted." The room erupted with nods and murmurs. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly with her small glass of port, raised her head just enough to speak. "Strong possibilities, Inspector, are very fine things, but I have always thought the weakest chain in human dealings is secrecy, and secrecy, once rattled, makes quite a noise." Graves frowned. "Meaning what, Miss Marple?" She smiled benignly. "Only that a missing button may speak louder than an entire telegram if one listens carefully." Her words lingered long after the inn had emptied. Villagers trudged home beneath the stars, whispering of buttons, telegrams, and clandestine meetings. But in the darkness near the churchyard, a figure slipped between the yews, pausing to look back toward the village lights. In one hand was a small object, another brass button, glinting faintly in the moonlight before vanishing into a pocket. Miss Marple, alone in her cottage, bent over her knitting. Her needles moved steadily, yet her thoughts darted like birds. 2 buttons, perhaps. 2 lies, certainly. And somewhere among them, the shape of the truth begins to form. The morning after the talk of buttons and telegrams, St. Mary Mead was already alive with whispers. The air in the high street seemed charged with a nervous energy, as though the cottages themselves leaned closer to catch the latest rumor. Miss Marple, shawl neatly pinned and knitting bag in hand, walked slowly to the greengrocer's. She was not in search of carrots so much as conversation, for in villages it was not always what people said aloud that mattered most, but how they said it. Inside the shop, Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Hartnell were already deep in discussion. They fell silent for a moment when Miss Marple entered, then resumed their talk with a touch more animation, as though eager for her to overhear. "I declare, Mrs. Hartnell insisted that the gardener knows far too much. I've seen him in and out of her cottage on odd evenings, and a brass button missing from his coat. Well, what clearer sign could there be?" Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. "But let us not forget Mr. Weatherby. Solicitors can be sly. Telegrams don't send themselves, after all." Miss Marple bent over a basket of apples, appearing absorbed in the fruit. Her voice was mild when she spoke. "One mustn't overlook that brass buttons are not so rare. They belong to more than gardeners' coats. Club uniforms, traveling bags, even certain officers' tunics, if memory serves." The 2 women exchanged glances, their eagerness checked. From behind the counter, Mr. Denham chimed in, his hands busy with the scales. "Still, it's Sims who's nervous. That's plain to all. He avoided me this morning and wouldn't meet my eye. When a man won't look you in the face, you can be sure he's hiding something." Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Ah, but sometimes, Mr. Denham, the very innocent look away. It is the guilty who learn to look too straight for fear of betraying themselves." Her remark set the room buzzing again. The villagers, each with their own theory, began contradicting one another until the grocer's shop sounded like a court in miniature. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the vicarage for tea. Reverend Clement, grave yet curious, leaned forward across the table. "The inspector seems set upon Weatherby and Sims both. He says one sent the telegram, the other may have lured her out. but I cannot see the motive." His wife, her knitting in her lap, added in a whisper, "Mrs. Arkwright was still a handsome woman. She had admirers. Jealousy is motive enough." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Jealousy, yes, but also resentment. Money unsettles people more than love, I've always thought. A disputed legacy, an unpaid debt that leaves sharper wounds than broken hearts." The vicar's wife frowned. "Do you believe someone in the village quarreled with her over money?" Miss Marple glanced at the fire, her eyes thoughtful. "I believe Mrs. Arkwright was clever with her affairs, and clever women, my dear, are seldom forgiven for it." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock. The maid ushered in Mr. Sims, cap in hand, face red from exertion. He seemed uneasy, glancing at Miss Marple as though he had not expected her presence. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to the vicar, "but I wish to speak with you about the funeral arrangements." The vicar nodded gravely, but before he could answer, Miss Marple leaned forward with her gentle smile. "A difficult time for you, Mr. Sims. I expect you spent many hours tending her garden, did you not?" One grows attached. Sims shifted from foot to foot. "I did my work, yes. She was fair with me, mostly. But she kept secrets, she did. Always little letters, always people calling." Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly. "Letters, you say? Delivered regularly?" "Not regular, no, but enough to notice. And she told me once plainly that some people here would never forgive her for what she knew." The vicar's wife gasped softly. "What did she know? Whatever do you mean?" Sims shook his head. "She didn't say anything, only that it wasn't safe for her to speak, and that was the end of it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. A wise woman, then. For secrets are dangerous currency. Once spent, they cannot be reclaimed. Sims gave a troubled nod and excused himself, leaving the vicarage in a hurry. Silence hung in the room after his departure. The vicar frowned deeply. "Secrets, Miss Marple? Do you think this is why she was killed?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think secrets are like threads. Tug one, and the whole garment may unravel. Someone feared hers would be tugged, and that someone is still lying." Outside, the evening bells began to toll. Somewhere across the village, another voice, urgent and angry, was raised in argument. It carried faintly through the twilight, a reminder that the calm of St. Mary Mead was only a fragile mask. Miss Marple, listening, allowed herself one quiet thought. Another piece had just slid into place. And yet, the full pattern of the puzzle remained hidden. For now. The following evening brought with it a chill that crept through the village lanes like a warning. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual, and lamps glowed in cottage windows, though few residents found comfort. Lydia Arkwright's death had unsettled even the most practical of villagers, but what came next deepened the unease into something closer to fear. Miss Marple, seated by her fire with her knitting, heard the commotion first as hurried footsteps pounding along the lane. A voice called for the inspector, strained and frightened. Rising, she drew her shawl about her shoulders and stepped outside. Across the hedge, a knot of villagers hurried toward the green, and above their anxious murmurs, one name was repeated again and again. "Sims! It's Sims this time." She followed at her usual unhurried pace, though her eyes were alert, taking in every glance and whispered word. At the edge of the green, just outside the Blue Boar Inn, Inspector Graves stood grimly over a huddled figure on the ground. It was Harold Sims, the gardener, his coat torn, his face pale and slick with sweat. "He's alive," Graves barked, waving the crowd back. "Clear off, all of you. Fetch Dr. Haydock at once." The villagers obeyed reluctantly, their curiosity struggling against the inspector's authority. Miss Marple stepped forward quietly. "What has happened, Inspector?" Graves scowled, scratching at his chin. "Looks like someone tried to silence him." He was set upon near the inn and knocked on the head. Nothing stolen, mind you. His purse was still in his pocket. That tells me the motive wasn't robbery. Sims stirred faintly, groaning. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to mutter a broken phrase. "The telegram. Not me, I swear." Then he slipped into unconsciousness. The words carried swiftly through the gathering crowd, despite the inspector's stern warnings. By the time Dr. Wenhadek arrived, half the village had already decided that Sims knew more than he had admitted, and that someone was desperate to keep him quiet. Miss Marple, watching the scene with her serene expression, bent slightly as if adjusting her shawl. In truth, she was studying the ground. The earth was scuffed with 2 sets of footprints clear in the mud. One heavy, broad-soled, the other lighter with a narrower heel. Both led toward the lane behind the inn. Later, when Sims had been carried away and the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the inn's doorway. Mr. Denham, the grocer, appeared at her side, his voice low. "I'll tell you what I think, Miss Marple. Sims was in league with her. Whatever secret Mrs. Arkwright had, he knew it. And now someone wants it buried with him." Miss Marple gave him a kind look. Perhaps Mr. Sims was only a convenient target. One must be careful not to confuse what is likely with what is true. Inside the inn, the atmosphere was tense. Several men nursed their pints in silence, speaking only when pressed. At last, Mr. Pritchard, a retired schoolmaster with sharp eyes, broke the silence. "I saw someone leave in a hurry not half an hour before Sims was found." Coat collar turned up, hat pulled low. "I walked toward the churchyard path." "Who?" Inspector Graves demanded. Pritchard hesitated, then shook his head. "Couldn't swear to it. It looked like Weatherby, but then half the men in the parish wore dark coats. Still, he had a certain stride lawyer's stride, I'd call it." Graves snapped his notebook shut. "That will do. I'll speak to him myself." Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful. She had known Weatherby's stride for years. Precise, measured, almost pompous. But the description of the figure with the collar turned up spoke to something different, an effort to disguise rather than display. As she walked home through the cool night, her mind replayed Sims's half-conscious words. "Not me. The telegram is not me." She paused at her gate, the phrase echoing, a dying woman clutching one telegram, a frightened man attacked for reasons he did not understand. Secrets, she thought, were multiplying, and when secrets multiplied, so did lies. In the distance, the church clock struck 10. The sound carried across the rooftops, steady and solemn. Miss Marple lifted her head, listening. She knew the village too well to believe these events were accidents. Someone was directing them with a careful hand, and sooner rather than later, that hand would be forced into the open. The attack on Harold Sims had left the village more unsettled than ever. Windows were locked earlier, lamps burned later, and conversations took on a hushed urgency, as though everyone feared their words might carry to unfriendly ears. Yet Miss Marple remained calm, her hands steadily guiding her needles, her mind sharper than any policeman's notebook. She knew that in matters of crime, time was the one thing people most often misrepresented. A murderer could not be everywhere at once, and thus their safety depended upon convincing others that they had been elsewhere. Alibis, Miss Marple thought, were fragile things. They frayed under the lightest tug. The morning after the attack, she paid a visit to Mrs. Hartnell under the pretext of delivering a pattern for a new jumper. The plump woman, already red-faced from stirring a heavy pot, welcomed her in with visible eagerness. Such goings-on, Miss Marple. First Lydia, then poor Sims, though I dare say he brought it upon himself with his shady ways. "Why, I saw him loitering near the vicarage not long before 11 on the day Lydia was called out." Looked shifty, he did. Miss Marple settled into a chair. her expression benign. "Indeed. That is curious, for I heard he was mending a fence near the orchard that morning." Mrs. Hartnell blinked, the spoon in her hand, pausing. "Well, perhaps it was earlier. One loses track of time, doesn't one?" Miss Marple only smiled. Oh, yes, indeed. The days slipped by so quickly. Yet inwardly she marked the change. Mrs. Hartnell's story shifted too easily. Either she had not seen Sims at all, or she had but wished to place him where suspicion would linger. Later that same afternoon, Miss Marple walked down to the post office. Emily Carter greeted her with a wan smile, looking weary from days of gossip pressing at her counter. "Such dreadful business, Miss Marple, and everyone asks after the telegram, as though I had written it myself." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I expect you remember the morning very well, my dear. Tell me, did you notice who came to the post office between 10 and 11 that day?" Emily frowned, searching her memory. "Oh, Mrs. Price Ridley called for her magazine, and the doctor's boy fetched some tobacco, but none sent telegrams. Not here, at least." "Quiet," Miss Marple said softly. "For the message was sent from Much Haddam, was it not?" Emily nodded reluctantly. "So they say. Though I can't imagine Weatherby bothering to walk all that way. He could have asked me had he wished." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Unless he wished not to be observed." Emily's lips pressed together, and she returned to her ledger. But Miss Marple had already seen the flicker of unease. It told her that the explanation, neat as it seemed, did not sit easily with those who knew the solicitor well. That evening she attended a small supper at the vicarage. Inspector Graves was present, his tone brisk, his appetite hearty. He laid out his conclusions for the table as though he were addressing a court. "Weatherby is our man. He sends the telegram, lures her to the gate, and then lies about his movements. And Simshy knew something, or guessed. That's why he was attacked." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "It is all very plausible, Inspector, yet I cannot help but wonder, why the churchyard? Why not her own garden gate, or the road where no one would interrupt? Murderers seldom choose a setting that complicates matters unnecessarily." Graves frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "Only that the place was chosen with care. The vicarage gate stands in sight of several cottages, does it not? A bold choice, unless one wished it to appear to be someone else's doing." The inspector harumphed, unimpressed. Yet the vicar leaned forward, intrigued. "Then the telegram has meant as a trick?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. "A trick, a lure, a mask. Call it what you will. But if one examines the time and place together, it suggests not passion, but planning. And planning, my dear Reverend, often points in an unexpected direction." As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple took her leave. The night air was crisp, and stars shimmered above the hedgerows. She walked home slowly, turning over the villager's words in her mind. Hartnell's shifting story, Emily's unease, and Sims's half-conscious protest. When she reached her gate, she paused. The latch had been moved ever so slightly, not by her hand. Someone had stood there recently, perhaps listening, perhaps waiting. Miss Marple closed the gate firmly behind her, her expression calm, yet her thoughts were clear as the frost-touched night. Alibis were cracking, secrets unraveling, and somewhere close, very close, someone was watching to see what she would discover next. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sharp frost. The lawns glittered silver, the hedges were crisp with white edges, and the air carried that clear, brittle quality that made every sound sharper. Miss Marple, shawl drawn close about her shoulders, set out early for a short walk, her step unhurried, but her eyes bright with purpose. She had resolved to pay another visit to Mrs. Arkwright's cottage. Inspector Graves had declared the place thoroughly searched, But Miss Marple knew well enough that men with boots and blunt fingers often missed what a careful housewife might notice at once. The cottage stood empty and still, curtains drawn. The constable stationed at the gate recognized her and gave a respectful nod. The inspector said you might look in if you wished, ma'am. Just don't disturb too much. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lavender polish and extinguished fires. Miss Marple moved slowly from room to room, her hands folded before her, as though she was simply admiring the furnishings. Yet her sharp eyes took in each detail, the overturned rug near the hearth, where the button had been found, the teacup with its brown rim of dried leaves, and the neatly folded gloves on the side table. She paused at the writing desk in the parlor. Its drawers had been rifled, left in untidy disorder by the inspector's men. Still, something about them troubled her. She bent low and ran her hand along the base of one drawer, her fingers catching on a ridge. With a soft click, a false panel shifted, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside lay a folded envelope, its paper thick, the handwriting elegant and bold. She drew it out carefully. The ink had smudged slightly, as though written in haste. On the outside, it bore no address, only a curious note to be opened if I should be harmed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She broke the seal gently and drew out a single sheet. "My knowledge is my protection," the letter read. "But if I am silenced, then let it be known that certain gentlemen in the village fear exposure. They have profited by deception, and I alone know the truth." No names were given, but the implication was clear enough. Lydia Arkwright had been holding something over someone's head. Miss Marple slipped the paper back into its envelope and tucked it safely into her knitting bag. She knew better than to wave such a discovery under the inspector's nose until the time was right. Evidence, in her view, was like jam spread too soon, and it spoiled the appetite. As she left the cottage, she found Mrs. Price Ridley waiting just beyond the gate, wrapped in her fur collar despite the brightening sun. "Poking about, Miss Marple," she said archly. "One would think of the inspector himself, the way you haunt that house." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Only lending a hand where I may. You know how men look but do not always see." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a sharp sniff. "Well, I hope you did not see the same as I did last night. Lights in the upper window, though the house is empty. I told Emily Carter as much, but she only laughed. Still, I know what I saw." "Lights," Miss Marple repeated gently. "Yes, just after 9. Flickering, as though someone carried a candle. I was quite prepared to summon the constable, but the light went out before I reached the gate." Miss Marple inclined her head, thoughtfully. "It is a curious thing, Mrs. Price Ridley, how often one sees more than one wishes when peering too hard into the dark. Still, it is a useful reminder. Even an empty house is seldom as empty as it seems." The woman looked faintly offended but bustled off with a swish of skirts, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. That evening, at the Blue Boar Inn, the talk was fierce. Mr. Denham swore that Sims's attacker must have been Weatherby, while Mr. Pritchard insisted he had glimpsed another man altogether near the churchyard, a man shorter, broader, and moving quickly as though he knew the ground well. Miss Marple listened quietly, sipping her modest glass of port. When the arguments grew heated, she interjected with her gentle voice. "It is curious how many eyes there were upon the churchyard that evening, and yet no one saw quite the same thing. One might almost think the very confusion was intended." The room grew quiet. Inspector Graves, seated by the hearth, looked at her with narrowed eyes. "You sound as though you know more than you say, Miss Marple." She smiled, her needles clicking steadily. "Oh, not more, Inspector. Only different. People often reveal the truth by what they leave unsaid. It is much like a dropped stitch. It shows at once to those accustomed to looking." Graves muttered something about women and their fancies, but he made a note all the same. As the villagers filed out, Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl. She thought of the letter in her knitting bag, of Price Ridley's talk of lights, and of the nervous haste with which Harold Sims had spoken of secrets. Each fragment was small, but together they formed a pattern. And though the final shape was not yet clear, she felt certain of one thing. Lydia Arkwright had been silenced because of what she knew. And in St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of curling back upon their owners like smoke in a closed room. Someone, somewhere among her neighbors, was choking on their own lies. The following day brought a stirring of new life in the village. Harold Sims, though pale and weak, had regained enough strength to mutter clearer words. Rumors spread faster than the Morning Post that he had spoken of telegrams again, of names half-formed upon his lips, and of someone who had paid her to keep quiet. Miss Marple, hearing this from Emily Carter on her way back from the post office, allowed herself only the smallest lift of her brows. Gossip could be misleading, yet within it there was often a kernel of truth. It was time, she thought, to let conversation do the work of uncovering what force could not. That afternoon, she arranged to call at the Blue Boar Inn. Several villagers were gathered there, including Mr. Denham, Mrs. Hartnell, and Leonard Weatherby himself. The solicitor sat stiffly in his chair near the fire, his polished shoes gleaming, his moustache bristling with indignation. Miss Marple slipped into her usual place, her knitting bag resting neatly on her lap. She greeted them all kindly, then asked in her gentle way, "And how is poor Mr. Sims faring? I do hope he recovers his full strength." Mrs. Hartnell leaned forward, eager to share her news. "Dr. Haydock says he'll live." "But he's shaken. He says he was attacked by someone he knew, though he didn't see the face." "That's not what I heard," Denham cut in. "My boy says Sims muttered that it was Weatherby, clear as day." Weatherby turned crimson. "Absolute nonsense. I was at my office until noon that day, and I told the inspector so." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Ah, yes, but you also walked along the Mill Road, did you not? At least, that was what you said." Weatherby stiffened. Yes, I took a walk. A man is allowed to stretch his legs." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed serenely. "And yet it is a curious place to walk after rain. One would come home with mud on one's shoes. Unless she paused delicately, one had a reason to go there." For a moment, Weatherby's eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught the smallest tightening at the corners of his mouth. He quickly recovered, but the slip was there. Mrs. Hartnell, sensing the tension, leaned forward with relish. "You see, he cannot explain himself. And I will tell you another thing. Lydia once confided she was afraid of a certain gentleman in the parish. She would not say who, but she trembled as she spoke." "Afraid," Denham repeated, astonished. "Yes," Mrs. Hartnell said firmly, "and I think we all know who she meant." But Miss Marple shook her head slightly. Fear is not always of the one who shouts the loudest. Sometimes it is of the one who smiles while holding the knife. Her words silenced the room for a moment. Weatherby cleared his throat roughly. "Really, Miss Marple, you deal in innuendo. The law requires facts, not fancy." She smiled kindly. "Facts can be slippery, Mr. Weatherby, when people move them about to suit themselves. But slips of the tongue, those are rarely deliberate. You see, one cannot help what escapes in a moment of agitation." The solicitor looked as though he might protest, but instead he rose, muttered something about business, and left the inn abruptly. The eyes of the villagers followed him, suspicion sharpening in their gazes. When the hubbub died down, Miss Marple gathered her things and made her way into the dusk. As she walked home, she thought not only of Weatherby's flustered words, but also of Lydia's hidden letter in her knitting bag. Lydia had written of gentlemen in the village, plural. That suggested more than one secret, more than one lie. At her gate, she paused, for a folded scrap of paper had been slipped into the latch. She drew it out carefully. The handwriting was crude and hurried. "Ask no more, or you'll join her," it read. Miss Marple stood in the fading light, the note trembling faintly in her hand. Her expression, however, remained serene. She tucked the scrap away with the same care she might give to a dropped stitch. For the first time, the threat had turned toward her, and that, she knew, meant she was closer to the truth than ever before. The note tucked into Miss Marple's gait had not unsettled her outwardly, though she folded it away with the same care she gave to her knitting patterns. She knew threats often betrayed desperation, yet it was plain that whoever had written those crude words believed she was drawing too close to the heart of the matter, and if that was the case, it meant she must be more attentive than ever. The following afternoon brought news that Harold Sims had regained sufficient strength for visitors. Dr. Haydock, stern though kindly, permitted only a few to see him, and Miss Marple, with her unthreatening air and gentle manner, was among them. She made her way to the small cottage where Sims lay propped upon pillows, his face still bruised and pale, but his eyes burning with something more than weakness. "You needn't fuss, Miss Marple," he muttered as she arranged the coverlet. "I'll be right as rain soon enough. But they'll come again, you'll see. They won't stop until I'm quiet for good." Miss Marple sat beside the bed, her knitting resting in her lap, and regarded him with quiet sympathy. "Then perhaps it is best you speak plainly, my dear Mr. Sims. Secrets weigh heavily, and they grow more dangerous the longer they are kept." He swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward the door as though fearing it might open at any moment. "It wasn't me who sent that telegram. Never was. But I knew she'd been warned. Lydia told me herself, 2 days before it happened, and said if she didn't play along, she'd be ruined. She had papers, letters, proof." "Proof of what?" Miss Marple asked softly. Sims shook his head. She wouldn't say, only that certain men had cheated business dealings, property, and money that never reached its rightful place. She said Weatherby was in it, but not alone. Others too. Miss Marple's eyes glinted, though her expression remained mild. "And did she show you these papers?" "Number, she kept them hidden, saying it was for her safety. But I think that's what they were after. When I went to her garden that morning, she was restless, packing things away. She said she expected a visitor at 11. She asked me not to tell a soul." He broke off, his breath ragged. "And I didn't. I swear it. But someone thought I knew more than I did. That's why they lie for me outside the inn." Miss Marple patted his hand. "You have done wisely to speak now, Mr. Sims. Silence is seldom rewarded." "Thank you." As she left the cottage, her mind turned swiftly. Lydia Arkwright had held letters, perhaps the very ones hinted at in the secret note she herself had found in the false drawer. And if Lydia had been blackmailing, then her death was not the result of passion, but of calculation. That evening, she encountered Inspector Graves striding up the high street, his notebook tucked under his arm. He stopped at once when he saw her. "I hear you've been talking with Sims," he said curtly. Miss Marple nodded serenely. "He is frightened, Inspector, and he has reason to be. He tells me Lydia possessed letters that compromised certain men of the parish." Graves frowned. "More village gossip. We've no evidence of letters." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But people do not risk murder over trifles. If you find those papers, Inspector, you will find your culprit." Graves muttered, clearly unconvinced, but scribbled something in his notebook before hurrying off. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her thoughts circling. Letters. Business dealings. Weatherby was implicated, but Lydia had written of gentlemen, plural. She thought of the brass buttons, of Mrs. Price Ridley's talk of lights in the cottage, and of the folded note at her own gate. Threads, all of them, crossing one another. At her gate, she paused once again. There, tucked neatly into the latch, was another scrap of paper, but this time it bore no threat. Only 2 words scrawled in haste they know. Miss Marple held the slip a moment, the frost crunching beneath her shoes. Whoever had written it was not her enemy, but someone desperate to warn her, which meant that not only was she closer to the truth, but others in the village believed she might actually uncover it. She tucked the note into her knitting bag and went inside. The fire glowed warmly, her needles clicked into motion, and her face was as mild as ever, but her thoughts sharpened like steel. The net was drawing tighter. Very soon, she felt, the guilty would trip upon their own lies. The chill of November seemed to deepen that week, and though fires burned brightly in the cottages of St. Mary Mead, the village could not shake the sense of being watched. Doors were bolted earlier, voices dropped lower, and even the postmistress kept a wary glance over her shoulder as she sorted letters at her counter. A kind of invisible weight pressed upon them all. Miss Marple moved about serenely as always, her shawl neatly folded, her knitting never far from hand. Yet her thoughts were sharper than the frost that rimmed the hedges. The notes slipped into her gate had told her two things. First, that she was perilously close to the truth, and second, that someone else in the village, someone hidden, wished her to succeed. On Wednesday afternoon she walked to the vicarage, invited by Mrs. Clement for tea. She found the vicar and his wife already in agitated discussion with Inspector Graves. The inspector looked up at her arrival with his usual brusque manner. "Miss Marple, I suppose you've heard more whispers? Everyone in this village seems to think of themselves as detectives." She lowered herself gently into a chair, smoothing her skirt. "Oh, I would never presume to outshine Scotland Yard, Inspector. But I do find that listening carefully to what people say and what they don't can sometimes be helpful." The vicar leaned forward anxiously. "It grows worse, Miss Marple. Last night another window was forced at Lydia Arkwright's cottage. Nothing taken so far as we can see, but the drawers were rummaged again. Someone is searching for those papers you mentioned." Graves scowled. "Likely a local youth. Mischief makers. I'll not chase shadows." Miss Marple gave him her kind smile. "And yet shadows often hide what daylight refuses to show. Perhaps we ought to consider who has the most to lose if Lydia's secrets were revealed." Graves harumphed, but the vicar's wife nodded gravely. "Mr. Weatherby insists he knows nothing, but he has grown so jumpy. And Mrs. Price Ridley told me that he questioned her sharply about what she might have overheard." Miss Marple's needles clicked once or twice. Indeed, one does not ask so pointedly unless one fears the answer. Curiosity can be quite revealing. That evening, she made her way to the Blue Boar Inn once more, knowing well it was the place where gossip gathered like smoke. As she entered, she noticed 3 men at separate tables. Weatherby, stiff and self-important with his untouched ale; Denham, the grocer, speaking too loudly as if to draw attention away from himself; and Pritchard, the schoolmaster, watchful behind his spectacles. She ordered her customary small glass of port and sat quietly, her knitting spread in her lap. The conversation swelled around her. "They'll arrest Weatherby soon enough," Denham declared, thumping the table. "Everyone knows he sent the telegram." Weatherby flushed crimson. "I deny it utterly. My affairs are my own." Lydia Arkwright was a schemer, always meddling where she shouldn't. She brought this upon herself. There was a collective intake of breath at his bluntness. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Oh dear, Mr. Weatherby, that is a harsh judgment upon a woman no longer here to defend herself. Most would speak more kindly of the dead, if only for appearances." Weatherby glared. "I will not paint her as a saint, Miss Marple. She threatened me, I admit it. She hinted she knew of transactions in which my name was involved. But I tell you, I did nothing unlawful. Nothing." The room stirred uneasily. His admission had been too sudden, too sharp. Miss Marple let the moment hang, then said softly, "It is always interesting when people deny a thing no one has yet accused them of." The solicitor's face darkened, and he rose swiftly, muttering about business elsewhere. As he passed, she observed the faint tremor in his hands. Fear. She thought not of guilt alone, but of exposure. When he had gone, Mr. Pritchard leaned closer to Miss Marple. He grows desperate. Mark me, there's more behind his bluster, but it isn't only him. Lydia Arkwright kept a wide net of acquaintances. Some of them had reason enough to fear her tongue. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. And fear, Mr. Pritchard, is the most dangerous companion of all. It makes people strike before they are struck. She rose soon after, making her way home through the lamp-lit lane. At her gate she paused, as was now her habit. Tonight there was no note, no crude scrawl. Only silence, the kind that feels too deliberate. She closed the gate firmly behind her and stepped into her cottage. By the firelight, she took out Lydia's hidden letter once more and read it again. Certain gentlemen in the village fear exposure. It was the plural that troubled her most. More than one man, more than one secret. The gardener's confession, Weatherby's outburst, and the broken alibi were each a fragment of a pattern still half concealed. Her eyes grew as sharp as the frost outside. Very soon she knew it would be time to gather them all together, to watch their faces as the truth was spoken aloud. And in that moment the guilty would reveal themselves more surely than any evidence ever could. By Friday, Inspector Graves could no longer contain his impatience. Rumors grew wilder by the hour, and with Sims still weak and Weatherby growing more belligerent, the inspector announced that all concerned parties would meet that evening at the vicarage. It would be, he declared, a chance to put the matter in order. The announcement carried swiftly through the village, stirring both excitement and dread. People arrived in knots of twos and threes, shawls drawn tight, voices low with anticipation. The vicarage drawing-room, usually a place of calm, now bristled with nervous energy as chairs were arranged in a half-circle near the fire. Miss Marple was among the first to arrive, her knitting bag resting at her side as though she'd come for no more than a quiet evening's visit. But her eyes, calm and sharp, moved from one face to another, watching how each villager carried their unease. Weatherby stood by the mantel, too stiff, his collar pinched, his fingers drumming against the marble as though he could not keep still. Denham, the grocer, muttered constantly under his breath, his gaze flicking toward the door each time it opened. Mr. Pritchard, the schoolmaster, sat ramrod straight, his spectacles glinting, his lips pressed tight as though guarding a private thought. Even Mrs. Price Ridley had insisted on being present, claiming she owed it to Lydia, though her eyes darted about hungrily, eager to miss nothing. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. We've had enough gossip. Tonight I intend to hear the truth. Mrs. Arkwright was lured to the vicarage gate by a telegram. That telegram was sent from Much Haddam. I have evidence that Mr. Weatherby was there at the time. Perhaps he'll explain himself to us now. All eyes turned to the solicitor. Weatherby's jaw tightened. Yes, I was in Much Haddam. I sent a telegram, but not to her. I will not say to whom it was. It was a private business matter. I resent the implication that it tied me to her death. A murmur swept the room. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Curious, she said gently. For if one were innocent, one would surely be glad to name the true recipient, rather than let suspicion rest where it does not belong. Weatherby flushed, his lips parting to speak, then snapping shut again. Before the silence could deepen, Denham blurted out, "She was blackmailing. That's what it was. Everyone knows it. She kept letters, proof of dealings best left quiet. She threatened to ruin men if they crossed her." The inspector snapped his gaze to him. "And how do you know that, Denham?" The grocer faltered. "I heard it said." "By whom?" Graves pressed. Denham shifted in his chair, unable to answer. Miss Marple let out a soft sigh, as though speaking to herself. It is odd how certain truths emerge. Poor Lydia did indeed keep letters. She told me so, in her own way, by hiding them where men in heavy boots would never think to look. Her hand rested lightly on her knitting bag, though she made no move to draw the letter forth. A collective intake of breath stirred the room. Mr. Pritchard leaned forward, his voice dry and precise. "If such letters exist, Miss Marple, then surely it is your duty to deliver them to the inspector at once. Anything less is dangerous." Miss Marple's eyes met his knitting. Dangerous, yes, for those whom they expose. But Lydia was wise. She did not write names. She left only hints, enough to warn, but not enough to hang. The tension grew heavier, each person glancing at the others with quick, suspicious looks. Weatherby scowled. Denham's fingers twitched against his knees. Pritchard's gaze never left Miss Marple's face. Inspector Graves barked, "This is going nowhere." "You speak of hints and secrets, Miss Marple, but I need facts. Who killed Lydia Arkwright?" Miss Marple's needles still. She laid them gently in her lap, her tone calm but carrying through the room. "Patience, Inspector. The truth is a delicate thing. Tonight you will see it for yourself. One need only watch who trembles when the light is shone." As if to punctuate her words, the vicarage clock struck the hour. The sound rolled heavily through the room, and with it came the unmistakable sense that the moment of revelation was close. The villagers sat tense, shadows dancing across their faces in the firelight. Each one waited for the next word, the next glance, the slip that would unravel the web, and Miss Marple, serene as ever, knew the time had come to draw the net tight. The vicarage drawing-room was heavy with silence. Shadows from the fire shifted across anxious faces, and every tick of the clock seemed louder than the last. Inspector Graves stood with his notebook open, his pencil poised, though his frown betrayed more irritation than confidence. The villagers sat rigid in their chairs, each trying not to meet the other's eyes, each secretly hoping suspicion would fall elsewhere. Miss Marple, serene and unobtrusive, continued to knit. Her needles moved steadily, the faint clicking a counterpoint to the strained hush. Then she set them down and looked around the room with a gentle smile, as though addressing a group of children. "Lydia Arkwright," she began softly, "was not killed because she was unkind or because she was foolish. She was killed because she knew something. She had letters, proof of deception in this very village. The question is, who feared her knowledge most?" Her words settled like dust in the room. Leonard Weatherby bristled, his moustache quivering. "You're determined to see me guilty, Miss Marple." "Yes, she threatened me, but I swear I had nothing to do with her death." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Mr. Weatherby, you are an excellent suspect. Too excellent, I think. You sent a telegram that morning, but not to Lydia. You were drawn into a trap as surely as she was." The solicitor blinked in astonishment, his outrage faltering. "A trap? For me?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle yet firm. "Someone knew you would appear guilty, and that person relied upon it. It was clever. But cleverness can be a dangerous companion. One thinks oneself unseen, yet human nature betrays even the best-laid plans." Across the room, Denham shifted uneasily. "All this talk of traps. You speak in riddles, Miss Marple. We want names, not fancies." She turned her gaze upon him, mild as milk. "And you shall have them soon enough, Mr. Denham. But tell me, why did you say last night that Lydia was blackmailing? That is a curious word to choose, unless you had reason to know." The grocer paled, his lips parting, but no answer came. The villagers leaned forward, breathless. Inspector Graves snapped, "Answered her, man." Denham's hands trembled against his knees. "I only repeated what others said. That's all." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, but I think not. Words slip out when one is frightened, and last night you were very frightened indeed. Blackmail, yes, You spoke as though the word burned your tongue." A tense murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward eagerly. "I knew it. I always said the grocer had dealings not quite proper." "Quiet, the woman," Denham barked, his face crimson. But Miss Marple's gaze did not leave him. "Lydia threatened you as well, did she not? Not with affection, not with scandal of the heart, but with something far less romantic. Money, accounts, the sort of thing a grocer might prefer to keep from the eyes of the taxman." Denham rose suddenly, knocking over his chair. "You've no proof!" he cried, his voice cracking. "No proof at all." "Sitting down," Graves thundered. Denham hesitated, chest heaving, then dropped back heavily into his chair, muttering under his breath. The villager's eyes darted between him and Weatherby, suspicion swinging like a pendulum. Pritchard, the schoolmaster, cleared his throat. "We cannot jump to conclusions. Accusation without evidence is no better than gossip. Lydia knew many things, and not all of them were true." Miss Marple turned her gaze on him, soft and unassuming. "Ah, Mr. Pritchard, you are quite right. Lydia may have exaggerated, but her letter was clear. She wrote of more than one gentleman who feared exposure, gentlemen who profited by deception." Her words lingered, sinking into the room like stones into water. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles, but his hands shook faintly as he did so. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "You see, it was not one man alone who feared her, but at least two. And in fear, they made a mistake. They thought the village would condemn Weatherby for his pride and his secrets. They thought no one would look further, but human nature, I find, always leaves a mark. A button, a lie, a careless word. And those marks cannot be hidden forever." Inspector Graves opened his mouth to demand more, but Miss Marple's quiet tone held the room more firmly than any order could. The villagers sat frozen, their faces pale, as the net drew ever tighter around them. The clock ticked on, steady and inexorable. The next words, Miss Marple knew, would break the matter open at last, and in that break, the mask of innocence would slip from the guilty face. The tension in the vicarage drawing-room had grown so thick it seemed to press against the very walls. Faces flushed, voices trembled, and suspicion darted from one villager to another like a restless bird. Inspector Graves, gripping his notebook, looked close to losing his patience altogether. Miss Marple, however, remained as calm as ever, her hands folded neatly over her knitting. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried clearly through the room. "You see, the truth of this matter does not rest upon a single clue, but upon many small ones. Alone, they seem harmless. Together, they tell the story of how poor Lydia Arkwright came to her end." The villagers shifted uneasily. Weatherby glared into the fire, Denham twisted his hands, and Pritchard adjusted his spectacles with fingers that trembled more than before. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle, almost conversational. First, there was the brass button, found beneath her hearthrug, out of place, belonging neither to her wardrobe nor her furniture. A careless thing, easily overlooked. Yet it told me someone had been there who wished not to be observed. Harold Sims's coat was missing such a button, yes, but there are other garments too with such fastenings. Certain club jackets, for instance, and school blazers worn by those who supervise them. Pritchard's face darkened, but he said nothing. "Then there was the telegram," Miss Marple went on. "Sent from Much Haddam at 10 o'clock, summoning Lydia to the vicarage gate at 11 sharp. Inspector Graves believed Mr. Weatherby sent it, and indeed the clerk remembered his presence. But one must ask, why would a guilty man place himself so squarely in the eye of the evidence? No, Mr. Weatherby was convenient, not culpable. He was meant to be suspected." Weatherby let out a strangled exclamation, half relief, half fury. "I told you so. A trap." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "A trap. For Lydia, certainly. But also for you. Someone counted on your stiff manner and your secrecy to make you appear guilty, and indeed you obliged them very well. A faint ripple of nervous laughter stirred, quickly smothered. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the room. Then there is Harold Sims. Poor man, attacked for no crime of his own, save that he knew Lydia spoke of letters. Letters that threatened certain gentlemen, and here we come to the heart of it. Those letters were not figments. I found one myself, hidden in her desk. She wrote that her knowledge was her protection, and that she feared it would be her death. She did not exaggerate. Inspector Graves leaned forward. And what knowledge was that? Miss Marple smiled gently. Knowledge of dishonest dealings, money diverted, accounts adjusted, profits taken at the expense of others. In plain words, fraud. Mrs. Arkwright had stumbled upon it, and she used her discovery to her advantage. She was clever, yes, but cleverness can be perilous when one faces men unused to being challenged. Denham sprang up, face red as fire. This is nonsense. You can't prove a word of it. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. But I can, Mr. Denham. Lydia wrote of gentlemen, plural, and indeed you betrayed yourself with your tongue. You spoke of blackmail before anyone else had used the word. Only someone who knew its truth would be so quick. Denham opened his mouth, closed it again, then sat heavily, his breathing ragged. And then, Miss Marple said softly, there is the schoolmaster, Mr. Pritchard, a man of order, of discipline, of detail, one who would know the value of a telegram and how to arrange times with precision, one who would wear a blazer with brass buttons like the one found beneath Lydia's rug. All eyes turned to Pritchard. He remained rigid, though a faint sheen of sweat glistened at his brow. Miss Marple's voice did not rise, yet every word seemed to strike with quiet certainty. You see, gentlemen, it was not one of you, but both. Mr. Denham, whose accounts Lydia threatened to expose, Mr. Pritchard, who lent his cunning hand to craft the trap. Together, you sought to silence her. Together, you planned her meeting at the vicarage gate. But planning leaves marks upon shoes, slips of the tongue, and buttons lost where they should not be. The room erupted in a storm of voices, gasps, protests, and murmurs of shock. Inspector Graves slammed his hand on the table. Quiet, Denham stammered. She's lying, making up tales to suit herself. But Pritchard remained still, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple with a hard, calculating look. At last, he spoke, his voice low. You have no proof. Miss Marple met his gaze serenely. Oh, but I have. The letters Lydia hid will suffice. And your silence, Mr. Pritchard, speaks more eloquently than words. The guilty, I find, are often betrayed by the very composure they cling to. The fire crackled. Outside, the church clock struck the quarter hour, and in that tense hush, the villagers knew the truth had been laid bare. Miss Marple, her knitting once more in hand, gave a gentle sigh. Human nature is very much the same everywhere. People believe their little deceits will pass unnoticed, but as I always say, life in a village teaches one to spot the tiniest of threads. Tug them, and the whole pattern unravels. The vicarage drawing-room did not empty quickly that night. Even after Miss Marple's quiet words had laid the truth bare, the villagers lingered, shifting uneasily in their chairs, whispering to one another as though still half afraid to believe it. Inspector Graves wasted no time. With a curt command, he had Denham and Pritchard placed under watch until the necessary papers for their arrest could be drawn. The two men, once so confident in their concealments, sat apart from one another, silent and pale. Denham muttered once or twice under his breath, but his defiance had ebbed. Pritchard, by contrast, sat stiff and upright, as though still a master at his desk, unwilling to show weakness before his pupils. Only his hands betrayed him, clasped too tightly in his lap. The vicar's wife moved about the room, pressing cups of tea into trembling hands, her face pale but determined to provide some semblance of order. Mrs. Price Ridley whispered to anyone who would listen that she had suspected them both all along, though no one seemed inclined to answer. The fire snapped and crackled, a reminder that life, despite murder, carried on in its ordinary rhythm. Miss Marple sat quietly near the hearth, her knitting once again in her lap. She had no need to gloat or repeat herself. The truth, now spoken, no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the village, which would pick it apart and weave it into a new story to be told for years to come. Inspector Graves at last came to stand before her. His expression was gruff, yet there was a trace of reluctant respect in his eyes. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, "you've done my work for me, though I'll not admit it to the Yard. You saw what I didn't." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, not at all, Inspector. You had the facts. I merely added a little observation. Life in a village provides one with endless practice in human nature." He gave a short laugh, though it held little humor. "Human nature, eh? I'll take fingerprints and confessions over that any day. Still, you were right. Blackmail, fraud, and fear were a poisonous mix. And Lydia Arkwright, a poor woman, paid the price." The vicar, standing by the window, shook his head sorrowfully. "It is always astonishing, Miss Marple, how evil creeps into the most ordinary places. We fancy ourselves safe, and yet, Miss," Marple finished gently, "safety is never so certain as we believe. People carry their sins with them, whether in cities or in villages. Only here are they more easily seen if one knows where to look." Outside, the night had grown still. The last of the villagers departed in uneasy groups, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the shadows as though the darkness itself carried guilt. Soon only the inspector, his constable, and the two accused remained. By the following morning, word had travelled beyond Saint. Mary Mead, the market towns nearby, would soon buzz with the tale of the widow, the telegram, and the men undone by their own secrets. At the post office, Emily Carter handled letters with renewed solemnity, while Tommy Briggs muttered that he would never again peek at a telegram, not if he valued his peace. At the Blue Boar Inn, the talk was endless. Some claimed they had always distrusted Denham's accounts. Others swore they had noticed Pritchard's too-polished manner. Gossip, like ivy, twined itself into every crack of the story, growing thicker with each telling. Through it all, Miss Marple went about her days as usual, attending to her garden, her knitting, and her modest calls upon friends. She made no speeches, no proclamations, yet those who met her gaze felt the quiet reminder that nothing in their lives was too small to escape her notice. One afternoon, a week after the arrests, Mrs. Price Ridley stopped her at the gate. "It was extraordinary, Miss Marple. Simply extraordinary. You must feel a certain satisfaction, having seen them unmasked." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were grave. "Satisfaction, my dear, is not quite the word. I feel only sadness that people so often believe their little deceits are harmless. They seldom realize how quickly harm grows from such seeds." Mrs. Price Ridley clucked her tongue and hurried on, eager to be the first with the latest version of events. Miss Marple watched her go, her expression unreadable. That evening, as the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her needles moving steadily. The flames flickered across her face, casting it half in shadow. She thought of Lydia Arkwright, clever and proud, undone not by strangers, but by the very men who had sat across from her in the village shop, nodded politely in the church pews, and pretended respectability. At length she laid down her knitting and whispered softly into the quiet room, "It is always those who believe themselves safest who prove most dangerous." The clock struck, the sound echoing through the still cottage. Outside, the village resumed its ordinary life, But the memory of the 11 o'clock telegram would linger, a reminder that beneath the most peaceful surface, human nature was ever restless, ever flawed, and sometimes fatally so.